Media too. And I'm just going to make a short, very brief introduction to Roz Barr. Roz taught here and at the Bartlett for many years. She also worked for Eric Perry for 10 years, and she has been running her own practice now for 3 years. The practice is focused a lot on craft-based processes, materiality, and they've been working a lot on historical sites. Ro will be talking about some finished projects and some work in progress. I particularly think that her work on her approach on craft is something that interests a lot of people here at the AA. So.
Thanks. I haven't slept very much, so I will do my best to make this engaging and that it makes sense. As Anna said, formed the practice 3 years ago. Was something I had always planned on doing. Unfortunately, my timing with the recession hitting when I'd made my decision to leap from being in quite a comfortable position within a successful practice made the leap far greater. But having come from an education where I started off at art school, not knowing what I wanted to do. I didn't study architecture, I studied sculpture, and then I took a very different route through design and then to architecture before I realized that I was in the right field. The interest in making and crafting was something that probably started back at art school, and this is something to do with how this process of making has greatly influenced my thinking of how we approach projects within the studio. This image, funnily enough, was taken while I was running a unit at the AA here. We were in Brescia in northern Italy, and I was waiting for students to find sites, and this is at the edge of a gravel pit, and it's a very beautiful object, made from objects found around the site, but beautifully executed and put together, and something that has stuck with me on also the way that we think about how we approach each project. My background for 10 years was with the practice Eric Parry in London, and you start a project, you do a competition, and at that time I was quite naive. I thought, well, maybe give this 3 years and we'll build this and then I'll move on. And 10 years later, the project is just coming out of the ground. One of the things that I guess when you're doing your education, your architectural education, is you're very much unaware of the parameters of which you're designing within, especially within the context of somewhere like Bath, where the idea of a modern intervention is kind of becomes a 3 to 5 year planning battle. And for good reasons at times, but also this idea of having an idea and actually believing in an idea and carrying through that idea is something that I think is very important. And it's also having the narrative and the story from the beginning set up, that it can't be questioned, and you're able to follow through. This is Great Pulteney Street in Bath, which is almost a viaduct that runs from the centre of Bath to what's known as Sydney Gardens, Sydney Gardens was one of the first pleasure gardens, and it is where the Holborn Museum, which was actually built as a hotel in sort of the 1790s, and is where Jane Austen lived across the road. She wrote Mansfield Park, and it was a place where people took tea and paraded and enjoyed entertainment within the gardens. It fell into demise, and in those days there was such things as, you know, buildings were left, and then someone decided to buy it and change its use, and it was bought in about 1902 by Sir William Holborn, who was a collector, and his family, who was a collector of decorative arts. And they commissioned an architect, very similar to what happens sort of 150 years on to where we are now, and transform it into a museum. The architect was Sir Reginald Blomfield, and probably the one move that he made was to turn his back to the gardens. So you can see the rear elevation here, which closes off a staircase on the rear facade to what it had been originally built. The idea of this veil at the rear of the building with the supper boxes on either side was an image that we captured at competition when we first started to research the site and research the idea. And it was our idea to re-engage with the Sydney Gardens, to reignite this fantastic connection with Bath and Great Pulteney Street, and a way to make connection both to Sydney Gardens, to the canal and Brunel's railway behind, and how we could do this with an extension to the rear of this Grade 1 building. We're dealing with very delicate Georgian facade, beautifully crafted in Bath stone, and it was about how we could transform and engage to bring back this magic, really, of memory of what had been through the materials we use. This is Magritte's painting Day and Night at the top, and it was this kind of moment of excitement and magic that always was an image that stuck from the beginning of how we could actually re-engage this in the gardens. And really the research and thinking behind a material that actually complemented the Bath stone. And so for a very long time I worked. We decided that it could be porcelain, the material. It had to have something that was crafted, that had a beauty to it, that was reflective, that actually reflected the gardens and the sky. And so it took me to research on faience and ceramic, and working with a company called Shores of Darwin up in Lancashire, who had been doing faience on buildings for over 200 years, and who were now only making sinks, Belfast sinks. But what we really enjoyed about that was the depth of the glaze, and that depth of glaze and that sort of feeling of something that has been crafted was incredibly important to the project. And it becomes a story with planners, it becomes a story with clients on how you can get them to engage in the idea as well. From having these fins that were made as prototypes, and just to show that how deep the glaze is, it refracts the Bath stone behind. These were actually a blue-green colour. And the Bath planners insisted that they were a Bath stone, and so the story went forward for about another year of identifying the qualities of Bath stone and looking at that palette in itself. And in the end, we had this sort of compromise of creating a ceramic that did both. And today, it's a successful addition, and it shows just how, without talking about the actual architecture of the extension itself, it's this kind of background that I came from and that interested me, and was something that I've sort of taken forward with our own practice. Probably slightly something else about the diving board. There's something about coming out of a very large practice and making the leap into something that you know you want to just engage with your own work. So the scale of projects very much changed. I was quite fortunate. My first client I met on a Ryanair flight, and he said he bought a house in Spain. Did I know anything about building? And I took that on as a project, and we helped, working with a local Spanish architect, look at the site. It's in the Alhambra. The idea was really within the landscape was a way of ordering this land. We were commissioned to build a pool house and swimming pool and take on quite a lot of the landscape around the site. And again, that really meant working. I was keen on using the natural stone that we were finding around the site where the construction work was going on for the house. And so working with the local sort of stonemasons, we were able to engage with these walls and to work with the levels in setting up the new pool house, which was embedded into the land, and swimming pool, and actually working with the existing landscape that was there. This is a site, again, you know, you've got this incredible rich soil, and it was about sort of embedding something into the land, away from the house, which sits in the background where you can see where the crane is, and actually working within the olive trees, using the natural stone to actually sort of embed something into the land. We worked with engineers in London to create this kind of concrete wall, which was in situ concrete, which could act as a terrace, so it gave you another plateau and level to enjoy the views around. And underneath there was a a bar and changing rooms, a gym and a small studio, and then that took you on to this level deck swimming pool. We use models not just as a way of describing the project to clients, but very much in-house, really, as a way of thinking of how we're going to build. The model kind of is the starting point, and this sort of first thinking of how we're going to craft or the idea or notion for the project. This was done by actually an ex-student of the AA who now works for me and was working for me on his year out. And he carved this out of a piece of walnut. And it really, to me, sort of, we talked through this process of really what the project was trying to engage with. It was very much from the land, and this idea of pulling up the terrace, almost like just raising the land, which was propped on the corner, and then cutting the pool into the same surface. These are just some images of it inside. So this is the concrete roof, which obviously the weight of the concrete, the thermal property of the concrete keeps the interior very, very cool. It has a central spine wall and these four fins in which sort of timber louvers are woven into that. So it's very simple, sort of T-shaped structure. Unfortunately, the quality of the build in Spain at the time was not very good. So it took more to me being there and actually working with contractors in order to get the details and to have it made. But it was an enjoyable process. And again, forming the walls. Often the drawings were unable to translate to the local guys who were on site. But it actually meant sort of more of a project of actually being there and deciding where staircases, marking them out, and just working with the land. And to the pool, it was about this idea of the pool engaging with that idea of the horizon. So there was nothing coming up from the land. We used local Spanish limestone, and it's still settling. These projects will take about 2 years probably before it starts to bed itself down. They've had a very dry summer, but the idea is still there. From a completely different scale, we were approached at the same time by friends who were wanting to buy a house, family house, didn't have very much money, outside of Manchester. And we're tired of buying Victorian terraced houses and converting them, maybe putting a glass box on the back, or putting a mansard in the roof as a way to get bedrooms for small children. And they said to me, we've seen this bungalow. Now there's thousands and thousands of bungalows in certainly the suburbs of this country, built in the sort of 50s and 60s. But incredibly interesting building types. You get single level living. Usually these houses sit within their own plot of land. They're just incredibly poor construction, built very cheaply. And they have a sort of association with the elderly. It's your sort of retirement home. It's not the dream home for a young couple. But as you can see, this house sat within this very large garden plot. And it was all down to the fact they had about £50,000 to spend. And what could we do for £50,000? So the economy and the efficiency within the thinking of this idea was really the driver for the project. Not just in what we could rebuild, but thinking what we could retain. So the birch ply back box of the house was the existing sleeping block. It had 3 bedrooms and a bathroom within it. So by retaining that and then wrapping a new extension to the front, we were able to remodel this house and give them a large living kitchen dining space on the front, a hallway where people could hang out. We're kind of amazed with the quality of housing that's being offered, where everything has to be worked to a very minimal dimension with minimal ceiling heights. So this idea was actually to play with volume. It's not expensive. It's the economy and efficiency of the materials you use and how you design and plan these spaces. One of the clients, they were both teaching at university, and they wanted the ability to work at home. And so there was a small office, which could also double up as a 4th bedroom. So it was this thinking through of how they would actually use the space. Pulling these buildings down takes probably about a day. They're incredibly cheap construction, as you can see here. I found we've documented quite a lot of the process, actually, of this project. You can see how through time someone has added another layer, the sort of faux stone cladding to the front. There was layers of wallpaper. So these houses have been well loved, well used. They're just shoddy and cheap construction. So we were able to maintain the build at the back and reorder the front space. To re-engage with the garden and the landscape was something that I felt was very important. So we were very considered about where light came in. This was the main south elevation onto the front garden where the living and kitchen area was. So we put in this sort of 10-metre long window to the front. We put on new pitch on the roof that had to work with the form of the back block. There was no money for a great structural steel scheme, so the thinking of materials and the efficiency of where we did use steel had to be maybe only used once. So we worked with Ramboll, and we have one steel beam that runs across as the lintel to the 10-metre opening, and everything else was done in blockwork and brick. So where we had structure, the structure became the material and it was expressed. And where we had openings, the side slot openings at the top allowed an engagement with the garden, which was actually quite well planted, and also to do with neighbours that were bothersome on the other side. So as we turned and worked around the elevations, it was making decisions about where light would and would not enter the building. Again, talking about making the model for this project slightly like a doll's house. I mean, the sort of 3-year-old daughter, Jean, at the time, loved this house. When I turned up, you know, she could understand her house, she could understand where her bedroom was. While doing the laser cutting for this, the plans and the elevations were always simplified. And I mean, I kind of enjoyed this project because there was such an efficiency to every detail, to every elevation, that kind of it was the piecing together or the assembly of, or the reassembly of this house. We were taking what was there, getting rid of the parts that we didn't want, and then piecing it back together again. We used a black engineering brick as the main facade. One of the clients is a fashion designer. She wanted a Tom Ford house. She said, why not? And so this black sheep house, as it was known by them, because the sort of suburban neighbours thought, what on earth are they doing? You know, why are they doing this to their very nice bungalow? So Black Sheep House it became. Working with a great local builder, we worked with local trades, so the local brickman was absolutely brilliant. We had a slate roof put on, and you know, there was nothing heroic about the sort of geometry or form. It was very honest. The materials were honest, and the design had to be incredibly honest. And you know, we used soft-framed, timber-painted windows because we couldn't afford hardwood windows, this sort of thinking through all the materials, the cost of every material, was a very different approach to where I'd been in Granada, where I'm with a hedge funder and his wife who, you know, let's fly the taps in from Spain, from America because we can, and you know, this became a sort of a very tailored project, but everything was done with intent and honesty. The idea of a house that actually closed down during the day. You know, Manchester's got, unfortunately, slightly high crime rate. We have this very big open facade. So the house shuts down, and in the evening it comes alive, and it engages with their garden and with the activity within. And there's moments with, you know, where we cut windows in to bring light into the facade in the living area, and then to the inside. So where we had new, all new, it was built in medium blockwork, and all the blockwork was expressed. We spent money on things like underfloor heating. We put just down plywood sheets as the floor. Doors were 2.5 meters, were 2.4 meters, because we could buy sheets of ply for that, or MDF for that material. There's no reason to have small elements when you can just be efficient with how you use the materials that you're using. The door frames are made from a piece of 4x1, which are rebaited, and even the contractors were saying, wow, this is actually easier. So this sort of tailoring and thinking through of how we could give quite interesting interiors. The hallway rises to sort of 4.5 meters. It's sort of a good width. So, you know, when they're having parties, people can hang out in the hall, which is what you want to do. Every inch of that of the house is used. And inside, where we have the steel beam at the top in the kitchen there, you know, we expressed elements. So parts of the structure became expressed within the interior. We've actually, weirdly enough, residential developments are coming at us fast and furious. Nothing I'd ever done before, but we're actually quite fortunate because they have given us this really interesting body of work, which I'll just show you a couple of projects of areas of London I wasn't familiar with, like Fulham, Hammersmith, and taking existing buildings, whether they're public houses or hotels or mixed-use buildings, often within conservation areas, and so looking at putting a commercial use shop or a restaurant at ground floor level, and then apartments, quite good quality apartments, not luxury apartments, but sort of middle of the road apartments in above, and normally can we adapt the building? I think most of these buildings are very interesting because it's often, I find when we first visit them, you know, there's a scene that's been left. This is, you know, some bedsit that's someone's walked away from, and we haven't done anything to when we enter. It's not been set up. But you get these grand rooms, you know, beautiful windows. It's just been left to rot. So we've taken these volumes and taken the buildings. And again, we're generally battling with planning on how we can add another an extension to, say, a roof, how we can knit in. There's a bit of sort of dentistry, really, and how we knit into these existing buildings and give interesting flats, apartments to speculative buyers. This one in Fulham, we were blessed with a very high parapet on the front elevation. So the idea was we could tuck in this kind of metal box behind this parapet and create these new duplex apartments with terrace to the rear, and you know, engage with actually looking at what can be interesting living. These are just a quick way that we work through ideas, just with cardboard models. But again, you can see the new intervention, which is the black metal extension, the zinc extension to the top. By gaining that floor, we have to rely on top-lit spaces, which again become quite interesting. The next series of photographs are done by photographer John McLean, who I've worked with on and off over the years. And rather than give him a brief to capture the work, he just has gone in and sort of done these triptych views of how he's seen the interiors. And again, it's reinstating what the good that is there. So keeping existing windows, upgrading the building fabric, putting in good quality oak floors, and you know, creating spaces and connections to other rooms that become interesting ways of living. We're probably doing, we have a portfolio of about 3 or 4 of these projects, looking at you know, how we carve staircases in or make staircases in, and how we can actually create quite pleasant living spaces from top-lit lights. And, you know, rethinking how we can detail handrails. We're always dealing with quite constrained spaces. So again, it's thinking about how we can make cuts in walls. You know, it's not about adding things in. Everything is thought through as part of the initial concept. And communal staircases don't need to be unpleasant. You know, they can be done very efficiently. These are a cast concrete staircase with a new black MDF cladding and a nice handrail. And so, you know, the residents have something that's quite pleasant to access their houses. Another refurb that's under construction just now. It's very fast track. I've never really been involved in anything as fast as this. Saudi Arabian school, King Fahd Academy in Acton, asked us to. They had a large auditorium space. They wanted a theatre for 200 children, and they have a very set way of working. You get one brief, you have one meeting. They say yes, no, we like that, and then it's on site. So here we've got a 60s, a bit like Holland's Lane, the bungalow. You've got this rather unattractive, unloved 60s comprehensive school, and it's just, you know, painting, not upgrading windows, just painting windows, re-signing a school to give it a new face as a theatre for the school. These are just simple images, actually all done for a client. Again, it's sort of this idea of representation for something that they would understand. You know, we've had to work with these existing brand new velvet curtains, but putting in a new seating structure. We've punched through this back wall at the back to create another seating area behind to increase the flexibility of the space. This is under construction. We're recladding all the walls again, working with a great joiner to actually be able to make and think through some of the details. We've put together quite a nice pack of information and just thinking through how the panelling is made and how that works with the simple construction. And so every corner and thought has been considered. In between doing these live projects, we have done quite a few international projects, competitions. I've kind of veered away from the UK competitions because we never get anywhere, and it's very difficult when you start up because you don't have a body of work, you don't have a reputation. So internationally we were successful in getting onto shortlists, and the church scheme that we did in Vula in Norway 2 years ago, we came second out of sort of 700 entries, and it was an interesting journey. I went out there like I do with all competitions to see the site. It's a kind of one-horse town, about an hour and a half north of Oslo, and in obviously a very wooded area. There's a very big pulp mill next to it, and this notion of church being a beacon in this very, actually quite flat landscape for a very large community, to a town that has 2 petrol stations and a hot dog stand. It became a very big moment of bringing people together and offering something within the church. The original church had been burnt down, a very strange act of arson. And you can just see in the middle there this kind of remnant of the ruin of the church that sat in the middle of the graveyard. The brief was to create a new church, public square, and to incorporate the ruin. They gave us 2 options on the site. One was where we've placed it to the left-hand side of the plan, or directly opposite the ruin of the existing. This is the community sort of mayor's house over to the sides there. And we also worked with German landscape architects. I've done a lot of work with Peter Latz in how we could replant an ordering with trees and benches, and actually make the graveyard part of this woodland and the church itself. Again, it had to be the brief. It said it has to be a timber building. I had done very little work with timber, but one of the materials that was, they used this granite because of the climate. So all the base of the existing buildings have this granite plinth, and then there's this kind of agricultural metal that is to the roofs of barns, etc. So there was a moment that we would engage with this sort of granite base to everything that was on ground, to the square, that's bush-hammered granite, local granite, to the base of this building. And then from that would rise this timber structure. It became close from that early watercolour sort of sketch idea that I thought about how we could create a plan that gave them this beacon. The original church had a steeple of 40 metres, so we knew we could work within that and then wrap the use and the plan around this central worship space. And this would be a beacon for the the community and coming towards this new site. The little building to the side is the original existing chapel. And I felt it important that it also faced on to this new public space. So there was this kind of grouping of old and new to form this new civic space within the town. And it was really how the new elevations engaged with the landscape, but also engaged with this idea of sort of spiritual worship within the main worship space. There was a single cut to the east elevation, which as the sort of main church window, and then the organ box kind of penetrated out onto the elevation that meets with the square. We had the notion of a bell tower on the square, and these would be kind of collaborations we would envisage with artists, probably local artists, as a way that this becomes more of a community project. Early thinking through of the elevations, and really again the model became a way of how we were thinking through this idea. We worked with Simon Smith, Smith Walbrook, who works a lot in timber as an engineer, and I knew myself from being to Norway and having also done previous competition in Finland, the harshness and how you build in that climate. So the idea of the shuttered tongue and groove external box gave the contractors a time period that then the external walls could be built, the shuttered box could be built, and then the interior could be constructed during the winter months. So there was a kind of continuous to this program. The kind of research and thinking, obviously, with stave churches and this kind of sort of mythical and narrative within Norwegian history, that meant that this interior could be, the brief had to be, it was all timber. So we came up with this idea of stacking these timber blocks. They're about, I think, just over half a metre long by about 200 wide, and there were manageable pieces that could then be stacked within to form the main worship space. And actually, unless you try it, you don't know you've done an idea that it works. And the model was the thinking, really, of, can we do this? You know, you can draw it, you can do great things in Rhino and such programs, but we knew, after a very long week of building and cutting in our shared office space, that it was feasible. So this set of images really tells the story, that this shroud to the external world and this crafted interior to the inside, and the idea that these blocks could be carved into, and they offered further sort of connection with the community itself. A really simple plan to do with a civic space, a civic face to the square where the bell tower was, main entrance on the corner, public entrance on the corner. So weddings, baptisms, celebrations could enter on to the main public space. There was an entrance at the top, which would be for the minister or the priest, and then there'd be a more private entrance for funerals to the east elevation at the side, and so that was the ordering of this plan. The only thing I felt was important was a way of sort of refracting sunlight. So a notion of suspending this bronze ring within the main worship space would also maybe play with the acoustic as well. Moving on quickly, Store Street, we, some of you may have seen, again, a competition we did for the London Festival of Architecture in last year, and we were successful, and again, it was something, you know, temporary architecture I hadn't ever done before, so that was a whole new world of thinking, and one of the main drivers for this project was a conversation we had with the Building Centre in New London Architecture, who were battling with Camden Council, because this is a car park, the North Crescent to, the South Crescent to Store Street. You probably know it's just across the block over there. And they wanted to get rid of the cars. There was sort of 4 or 5 car parking spaces, and they wanted to regain this crescent to be able to use it for events and to use it for pop-up events, and also for the people working around there. I mean, at the time when I was teaching at the AA and I was teaching at the Bartlett, we had office space over in Newman Street. There's nowhere to go and eat lunch. You know, there's no public space. It's you know, you kind of just wander around Tottenham Court Road, and there's a little park on the other side of Tottenham Court Road, which is packed in the summer. And it was interesting all of a sudden to walk around and know the area and think, actually, yeah, there's private squares, but there's no small areas of public space. So the brief was really to think about how we could design something that was temporary, but could show how this space could transform. I was really engaged by the existing cobbles that are on Store Street. And one of the other ideas that was driving at the time was finding a way of reconnecting the South Crescent to the North Crescent. The North Crescent was, there's a very ugly concrete building, and that's where Eisenhower ran the D-Day landings from. There's connections to Good Street. So there's all this kind of embedded history there that one is not aware of. And so I thought it had to be a community project. It had to be something that could be built relatively quickly. And I came up with this concept, slightly driven by Eisenhower and images that I saw of buildings in London during the Second World War where they were protected by sandbags. I liked the idea of taking a ready-made object and actually rethinking of our perception of the sandbag to do with disaster, flooding, or war, and how it could become, we could transform this object into something else by a different application. And this had to be something that was tactile, something that was engaging. And also the use of a single material, you know, expands this notion of space, this idea of surface. And so that became our thinking for creating this public space. The other idea was we wanted to have this kind of disc of water. At the time it was flooding everywhere at the beginning of the summer last year. So on the news all the time was more flooding. And so there was this sort of tension between, you know, this idea of water and the amphitheatre and this surface that would be of the sandbag. Again, this model has travelled far and been used a lot and picked away at. Well, really, it was to convey this notion, and it was used for planning purposes, and we were successful in gaining back this square for the residents of Store Street. And then a lot of research, going back to when you look at the research done for something like the Holborn Museum, even though you've only got 3-4 weeks to design and build and raise the money and physically make this crescent, which I didn't realise I was doing, It was important. It's about detail. It's about understanding the material and the object that you're wanting to use. Grade 1 military sandbags are beautifully, beautifully made. And we did a lot of research. We have a lot of sandbags in the studio, unfilled sandbags. And the stitching on these grade 1 military sandbags are beautiful, blanket stitching. And it was a real craft industry. We worked with a guy called Paul Mitchell Sachs down in Cornwall. He'd been making these sandbags for 100 years, and there was nothing else like them. The kind of new plastic sandbags that you see looking very sad on holding down motorway signs, and I found myself cycling around London and seeing another sad sandbag. Just has nothing to this grandeur of the military grade 1 sandbag. And it was this idea of the stitching and the thinking of that became really important. And I'll go on to show you where this world of sandbags has taken us now, but the idea of the Hessian as well, it's the colour, it's sort of embedded in that without changing it. Why change it? Why try and do something else? And that was really important to me, that we kept to the idea, that we weren't sort of trying to do something cheaper or different. And so the sand came from Paul Mitchell's in Cornwall. It's dredged in the river, so there's a bit of ecology. Not that I'm at all sustainable, I have to say, in my thinking, but there was a nice story about this really good quality sand coming to London, and we would use it in children's play parks across London, I said, and we did. So there is a nice narrative to this. Getting the sandbags there, the 7 articulated lorries came during the night, and then with some graduates, we had 3 days to build this project, and it was a fantastic experience. It was incredible how the Saturday and Sunday, people stopped and asked and talked to us, and we'd planned it, we'd drawn it, we'd detailed it, and it really seemed to capture people's imagination, and exactly this idea of how we saw this object, where they saying, "What are you building? Is it a bunker?" But then afterwards, apart from the fact it rained continually for the 3 weeks it was up, people really used it. And it didn't matter that it was wet. It was like a sort of English beach on a summer's day. People still sat on it and ate their lunch. I think one of the nicest, I gave a couple of lectures there, and, as people said, I didn't realise that I never stopped, or there was nowhere to make a telephone call or come out of an office and just have 5 minutes. And so this kind of randomness actually engaged with the public. It was from here that we were invited to Venice. And God, do they need sandbags in Venice? So, they thought, this is good. And we were invited actually to come up with an idea. They really just wanted Store Street for Venice. And I was unable to do that. I mean, we don't think like that. I don't think like that. So I said, well, we'll look at a site and we'll look at what we can do. I mean, obviously the sandbags and Venice in ruin and Venice flooding Venice, it worked. But it was understanding how we would apply this. This was last January in St. Mark's Square. We were asked to look at a site on San Giorgio, the idea of squares in Venice and public space in Venice. We have this fascination in this country of creating new public space and filling it with furniture and tat and benches, and the Italians don't do that. They have empty space to communicate, to greet, to talk. to parade or to, revolt, and they find purpose for that space. So to kind of just put benches into an empty space seemed inappropriate. I really like this notion of the walled square and the strength of these images that you see of St. Mark's, of this contained square. And the site that they offered on San Giorgio was, or could have become, the sort of fourth cloister. So I spent quite a lot of time there earlier, about a year ago actually, sort of thinking of how we could transpose this notion or success that they wanted of Store Street here. What was interesting is that the paving in front of Palladio's church and the paving in Venice is called Masegni, is actually a similar size to the Sandbag. It's about 70 centimetres by 30 centimetres, and it's very particular to Venice. And it was this idea of how the paving addressed the facade or addressed the church that became interesting. And also not just outside the building, how that paving meets the water edge, how that becomes steps. And it's this surface that continues on. It kind of was an idea that we've been thinking through. And also inside, the idea of the marbling and how that hierarchy of space through one material can change and sort of be redirected. And so this idea of surface, using the module and using a pattern and maybe thinking how we could bleach the material and how we could, rather than place objects onto the surface could rise and become filled with water, or in a summer's day you could sit onto this surface that worked. We had the experience, we had all this knowledge from research on that we had from Store Street. So, the thinking evolved. What didn't evolve with San Giorgio was really, it's quite difficult when you are given a space and then, the monks don't want you to have as much space as that, and the funding that you have to raise, and the whole cost this year of trying to conceive this project, it just wasn't gelling. And also, this is not what squares in Venice are about. Squares in Venice happen between buildings. They're passageways that come together. They're not, let's build a church and, oh, hello, let's have a square. It's actually the spaces around, the spaces in between these buildings. And this just felt like such, even though we were being asked to give them this square, this idea of the walled square just didn't work on plan. And I'm happy to show this and happy to say that it doesn't work. It's an idea. The thinking was there, but it didn't engage with the notion of what we were trying to do. So I stopped, and we were asked about a month ago to reconsider doing a proposition for next year's Biennale, I should say. And so we went back to Venice, and we started to think about Venice and think about where in Venice. It didn't want to be on the site of the Biennale because, again, that's about something that's staged, or not that what we're doing isn't staged, but I wanted it to be within a space or within a square. And I like this drawing very much because it shows just the structural walls of Venice and how they are orientated towards the canal or to the lagoon. And the square that's in red there is San Lorenzo, which was something that was more than the square. This idea of what I was talking about, squares happening between buildings, this kind of culmination of spaces, passageways, and always the well, and the importance of the well, of how it's centered within the square or to the edge. It's always about coming together. And the surface and this idea of Masegni, continuing along, is something that we felt that it had more of a narrative to what we were talking about. San Lorenzo is an interesting, sort of architecturally, the church. It was the facade that was never built. It was sort of built in the 8th century, and there's been many, many adaptations. And I mean, we criticize today, you know, where we're taking existing buildings and knocking down buildings and, you know, adapting. We've always been adapting cities. You know, cities have always evolved. And, you know, it makes it more of a challenge as an architect to think about, you know, ruin, not ruin, you know, what part of fabric we respond to and what we don't. And this beautiful facade that was never complete in itself is a very beautiful wall. And this drawing at the top was the facade that should have been. You know, the importance, this is a Bellini, the painting of the passage to San Lorenzo, and the interior, which now the church is locked up. It's been used as a Biennale site, but, you know, it's left unused, unloved. So there's many elements that we're working on just now, hence no sleep last night, of how we can take this forward as a project. These are the images that really stuck with me from Store Street. This is Amiens Cathedral in 1915, where the locals and the army protected the cathedral, and they created these beautiful, beautiful walls using sandbags. And I was quite touched when I came across these images of, again, you know, here we have the ready-made, and here we have in a time of war, and this kind of ordering and thinking of this facade protection. But also quite powerful is this object. So we've been working through this casting, this model, and playing with the thinking at this time. Again, how we can take this idea of the square becoming part of the only connection across the lagoon, but actually building a wall that maybe never was, and a wall that isn't about defence, isn't about keeping people out, but it's a wall that you enter, and it becomes another passage to the square. And thinking again this idea of surface and marbling that we were thinking about before. And a wall that has two sides, one that is towards the square and the other wall towards the church itself, and this dislocation of wall to create this new space. And the thinking will go on this one. And so forth. And possibly we will be able to offer another space. And finally, just another part of the country that we're working in is in Scotland, up on the Argyll coast, in Argyll and Bute, just south of Oban, a place called Loch, Neish. I was approached by an old client who's a trustee on the museum, actually, about a year ago. Sent me a photograph and said, "Oh, if I showed you this site, what would you do? What would you build?" It's a 12th century medieval kirk, the remnants of the graveyard around it. And there's this kind of strange ensemble of buildings. There's a boathouse down on the edge of the loch, in the corner there. And there's what's known as Kirkton Steading. So there's a farm cottage and a barn that sits next to this medieval kirk. And the land has been in the family for about 150 years, I think. And they have a lot of these little buildings that they want to use as for the family, but also as holiday lets, holiday cottages. And so I got sent this photograph, and I kind of looked at it and sort of texted back saying, oh, I think I would build a tower. And he said, oh, that's funny. Nobody else has thought of that. And he's been passing this around, it seems, for a few years to various architects. And so we are about to submit to planning. It's been a long year of battling with planners and Historic Scotland because of the prominence of this site. But the thinking is all good, I think. Again, it's beautiful to be asked to have this opportunity, but also there's sort of the crafting and thinking of how we could adapt the site without touching too much of what's there. What's there is very beautiful, and you know, with some windows, a new roof. It doesn't need to be insulated. It needs to be dry. It is how we can adapt this grouping of buildings, and the views are stunning. You know, it's a landscape project. It's not a building project. It's more of a landscape project. But the brief was a sort of 4-bedroom house. The other brief was the boathouse. Again, it's sort of, you know, well, how would we do this? You know, you're sort of playing a game of, well, how can we build one project and then move on to the other? The boathouse is probably the simplest one, and the one that we would tackle first. It's a sort of corrugated steel facade with a big opening, concrete plinth, where they would drag the boats into, and it sort of works with the tide. But it's quite an attractive and handsome facade. And why knock it down? Why rebuild this? It has lots of elements that are good. It has a very strong base of concrete. And it sort of anonymously addresses the edge of the water. So this is just a simple thinking of how we stretch and jack up. So we cut the base of the cladding, and then we prop and jack up this existing steel shell. And we create a new platform for sleeping with a staircase above on the concrete, and build a toilet block to the back. By jacking up this facade, you'll get these windows on the long elevation, so you'll engage with the landscape. You'll be in the landscape, but always get the great view from the main elevation. And these are, you know, if we work through ideas of whether it's timber or if we don't keep with the steel wall, but just keeping that form. The battle will not be the boathouse. The battle is with the tower, and with the setting, as you can see in plan here. It's very much working with this edge. The rock behind the existing steading is where the stone for the steading and barn were taken from. So they would arrive, the crofters, and they would just work with the land to build a house, and hence the kind of orientation of this within the landscape. And also how it sits to the wall of the kirk. You know, they weren't obviously being met by English heritage when addressing this project. But it's very beautiful, this oak tree that sits to the side of the kirk, and the only other tree that sits on the rock behind. So it's actually working with the land and how it's orientated to the views, to actually engage with something that becomes a 6 metre by 6 metre plan, and it slightly turns its back to the kirk. So it's slightly dancing away from this form of the two houses. The notion of tower obviously is heavily set within this sort of Scottish vernacular. Not even, I mean, Italian Renaissance, this idea of folly, in the landscape. They weren't just built for defence. They were built as a way of saying, look at us, we're here. They became quite playful structures, with turrets, lookout terraces at the top. And, they had this sort of minimal intervention at ground, which I felt was incredibly important within this historic setting, that we weren't cutting into the landscape. We were actually touching the ruin and touching the land, in not a great way at ground level. And so we built a lot of towers. We wanted to test height, we've been already reduced in height by planning, but we will continue. Again, it's how this grouping of buildings from the boathouse to the kirk to the new steading sits within this landscape. Thinking through the form of the tower itself has been very much part of this process. These are cast maquettes that we started off with. It's very much not about windows. You're in the landscape all the time when you're up there. You don't need great views from windows into the Loch. You just go outside and you're in it. You go on the roof and you're in it. So a bit like the kirk, you get these kind of cuts within the wall. And we doing a timber structure, so the walls will be load-bearing stacked stone, hopefully from the rock behind the site, if not sourced locally around the area. There's a lot of disused buildings, a lot of ruins, so we're working with a local stonemason up there, and he's gathering pieces of stone from projects that have been left to ruin. And this wall will grow, it will go green. It will take on the landscape. But also the jointing and thinking through of what is seen is incredibly important. And these are just a series of studies. We're close to the sort of second in. We need to give them some windows. But, this idea of slot. And sort of, it's not about, an interior that's, why is that window there on the outside? Why is it to the left and not to the right? There's a kind of rigor to plan. It's a staircase, and there is a bedroom on every floor, with a toilet or a shower to one side. And so, the depth of this cut, of whether the window is, half a metre wide or it's, 30 centimetres wide, is dependent on how each elevation turns in response to use and to landscape. And so the plan, we haven't included very many drawings, but the ruin at the back, which will become the walled garden. So that is the entrance garden to the kirk. We're adding this porch, entrance porch to the side of the plan, which you will enter the farmhouse. You'll get a living space and a kitchen and dining. Now that house in itself, someone could live in on their own, or a couple could live in, or stay in. We'll probably build a mezzanine. We're just basically doing a very light touch to the inside of that. We'll put in new windows. We will line the walls and the roof, but very little else. The idea as a grouping of buildings, as one house, is you go outside into the land to enter the next building. It doesn't need to be covered, you will get wet, but you're always within the land. The existing outhouse will just be a large reception, sort of party space, I presume, with a log store at the back. And again, the ruin of the walls that are there becomes another internal garden. We're not touching or doing any adaptation to that area, but that becomes the connection between the tower and the outhouse. And then, as you can see, you have a new entrance as you come around the back of these buildings into a staircase and then a room. And the plan is repetitive, really, on 3 floors until you enter at the top, where you're in a sort of 4-metre high living space. A simple plan, again, it reinforces this 6-metre by 6-metre and this kind of disconnection from what is there. And the idea of a staircase that from the top floor will take you out onto the roof. Slightly, Salim will laugh at this if he remembers his student days with me about the obelisk, you know, the rising of this forum. So you have this, you know, 18-metre barn that's there, and how that can be elevated. Through now we're in detail, it's changing in form, but I think it's this proportion is important to what we achieve. And the staircase at the top, you know, it will be steel. We're looking at a lot of research just now into shot peen steel because it will weather very well, and something that's it's an add-on. It's not. It doesn't have to be the stone. It is something that will take you up in a much lighter world to the views beyond. And that's it. Yeah, sure. Or not.
Any questions?
Oh, hi. Hi.
Oh yeah, thank you. Hi. I sort of wanted to observe something in the projects, which is that there's a real material consistency in each one. And it seems like there's a kind of, I don't know if this is how it happens, but there's a sort of intuition about the material, which then, because of its consistency, actually allows you to have a strategic consistency about dealing with the landscape. Because it's really striking how in each one, there's a real kind of thinking about the particular material down to the detail, but there's also a strategic intent about connecting or sort of disposing things in the landscape. And I wonder if that, the idea of material consistency is actually integral to that.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I mean, it's this idea of sort of content and context. So it's not just the use or the brief, it's very much about where am I and how do you respond. And I think about having, I never understand, you know, sort of facades where, you know, you see the great plan and then you think, why is it dressed in that? It's a bit like how you get dressed in the morning, you know, there's a sort of intent about what you put on and why, or why you engage with material. And so I think, to me, it's simple. It doesn't feel like, oh, what are we going to make this one out of? You know, it's a bit difficult with the church in Norway. You know, I've never done a timber building. I didn't really think about it, but was told. So from that, you know, you approach it in a different way. You know, it's a different type of brief. Here, it was very much about the land. You know, and I think it's about thinking, looking at the material and studying the material. You know, there's a whole lot of thinking on how we build this wall, how we make this wall. The scale and size of the pieces, you know, the fact that it will be rough, it's not going to be, you know, it's really thinking about the linings of timber, and anything that's added to that will be metal. So there's this kind of hierarchy of thinking, and it keeps it quite pure, and it means that you're constantly readdressing you know, things to do with plan and ordering, and so the whole thing is integral. You know, it's not that the structure, like Holland's Lane, you know, those big window openings, you know, it has to have the thinking through that the structure is part of this architecture. Obviously it always is, one would say, but, you know, it needs to have an honesty about it, and it doesn't need to be anything more than that. And I think what I find quite not challenging, but I'm surprised about with doing sort of residential developments is, again, you know, what one's expectation is as the user, as you know, it doesn't have to be what we see, what what we expect with materials and things can be done in a rather more inventive way, but thinking about how that again is knitting into the context that you find. So, yeah, is the answer.
Okay, thank you. I want to know, from the drawings to the build, there are differences when the building is finished.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are so many differences. When you drawing a building, when you make the drawings, and when you finish the project, the building, when it is ready, there are so many differences from the start to the end.
Are there, or as an architect, there is?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a process, isn't it? I mean, you do a different type of drawings. It's about representation. In how you do different drawings for different people. You know, for the theatre, we have these very childlike, simple montages because the client could only understand that colour and wall. You know, it's incredible. So many clients. You know, I met with someone 2 weeks ago. We were in their house with the plan of the house, and she's saying, "But where am I?" You know, it's quite astonishing. You know, you're like, you were here. You know, we're here on this plan, and there is the window. And she's like, I still don't get it. I don't know where I am. So you have to adapt representation to the viewer. But I mean, I think there always will be changes to details. You know, we have drawing packages. I mean, I'd have included very few drawings really within this presentation, but in fact I was laughing tonight, this afternoon when I was putting together some guys in the office, because I was saying, oh, it's such a good plan, isn't it? It's such a good plan. It's a great plan. Maybe we should just show plans and not show any images, but you know, that would be boring probably. But you know, the strength of the drawing, the strength of the thought and the idea is generally there, give or take, you know, changes to detail to do with construction costs or planning. You know, there's a narrative, there's a history, there's a relative. But I think what I was trying to say at the beginning is that if you have an idea, you have a conviction to see that idea through, not in a some sort of statement of fascism or something like that, you know. But you want to make. You want to see that clarity of thought being followed through. So it's hard work, but I think it sort of pays off sometimes.
I'm curious about your language and your references because I see a reference to perhaps a certain something that we could call a vernacular, like in the use of materials and concern with craft, materiality, how things are built, and especially with the shroud, kind of trying to reinvent that element or kind of figure it out in kind of certain level of detail and texture. But I also see a kind of a very strong modernist thread, like especially in the way you work with form, and the form is usually quite bold, strong, and I'm just curious about how these elements come together and how these elements then relate to the historical sites that you're referring to, and if you think about that, or if you know if there are particular references that you work with.
I don't. Maybe you don't really understand. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's quite pure. I mean, it's sort of. I mean, reference tends to come from the context or from the site. It's. I'm not. I can't think of. Sorry, you have to excuse excuse my brain, it's really not working very fast. I mean, I do think about, the plan or the form of the project. Yes, they're quite, I don't know if modernist would be a word that I'd thought about at all ever. I can think of other words, but there's a sort of simplicity maybe in how they're worked through, knowing about how we're going to make the building, but also on this sort of simplicity of the volume or the space. You know, I often, I think both talk to each other. Something like the church actually took quite a long time to get to. The plan didn't. The plan and the ordering of the internal spaces. You know, there was a lot of rigor and a lot of thinking about how each side addressed the context of that, but also what the activity within. And there was a kind of hardness to the materials at base and ground, and there was a sort of anonymity to what was going on the outside.
I think it's interesting, for instance, if you compare with the work of Lina Bobardi, who's also using similar references, like she's also very interested in the vernacular, she's also very interested in the modernist language. And she was, as I understand it, she was quite tactic in the way that sometimes she would make a building that is public and then the form is quite bold and it still has like references to the vernacular, but the kind of the idea of this strong, bold form is very important. Like she made a project for a church that is not very well known. I don't know, when you were presenting your church, I was thinking of hers. Again, for a kind of small community, but there she uses a kind of very understated language, very based on kind of the vernacular, the traditional houses, and she actually builds a shroud as well. But I think she had this kind of tactic strategies which are kind of very easy to understand now. When she was doing something public, it would kind of verge more towards modernism, perhaps, and when she was doing something more local or private, she would then, research the vernacular. Of course, it's not that simple, but like in that sense, it's quite interesting, surprising to see like a residential project that takes this form, like thinking through this. So I was just wondering if there was some.
I mean, the idea of the tower is going back to, the idea of this object in the landscape or the tower house, and if you research this, sort of the notion of tower house like we showed, there's so many that we could look at, but it is doing many things. It's addressing the landscape, it's addressing this idea of views, getting up high, having a very small plan. I mean, this was all to do with a minimal intervention, it was not about, I had a planner that knocked the tower over and said, why don't you do a courtyard house? And it was like, because I'm not, that's totally not what this project's about. It's about the land. And, you can stand and talk to many people about the context of why you've arrived at a certain point. It's not about monumentalism form on this, although you could say that, but it's not. It's about it is about this balancing of the land. The height of this tree, the kirk wall, the strength of that kirk wall, and what we can do with stacking low-bearing stone. So it's that thinking through really the plan and how it becomes the culmination of this grouping of buildings that is why the tower was what came to mind when I first saw a photograph on my phone of what would you do. It's more intuitive than
yes, and it's true that
I can't really say. And with the church, again, it was from going there and actually it's not about a decorative facade, you know, the decoration can happen on the inside. A lot of it comes though about how you would build it, you know, it wanted to have this very simple and you know, like the agricultural farm buildings, the shuttered timber barns that you see across Norway and Scandinavia, you know, and they paint them red or they paint them, you know, and these kind of forms interested me, and it was taking something like that but turning it into a place of worship. So I think the reference always comes from what's around. I think the story of how one approaches a project. You know, with Venice, it's been extraordinary. You know, it's sort of like being forced to give something, do something that just doesn't respond to context. It doesn't respond to the idea, and we don't just do projects for the hell of them.
No, I was just pointing out, I think this is interesting because it's a tower, yet it's vernacular, like, or, you know, it's a kind of vernacular interpretation. So it kind of touches on all these issues in quite a complex, like, difficult way to, I suppose, to categorize it. And in that instance, I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Any other comments, questions?
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks very much. It's amazing projects.
Oh, thank you.
Actually, I didn't know your practice, but
Oh,
it's
okay.
really nice.
Thank
And for me, probably my question is very boring, but
you. No, it's
I'm
okay.
interested in where do you, I mean, for example, which is the source of your inspiration? For example, living architects or some architects from the past. Do you have any particular style that you are, I mean, you like, or you?
I mean, I have a host of.
Or there is a lot of
reminds me when I
different.
first went to, I think, came here for an interview. Who's your favourite architect? I don't know actually. I mean, there's so many, you know.
Yeah,
there's so
that,
many. I mean, Lina Barbardi is fantastic, but I wouldn't use her as reference. You know, I'm just interested. You know, people like Leverance. You know. Oh, so many. You know, it's. I can't think. You've blown me away with that question. It's not a boring question. I think I just observe. Really, I kind of look. I've never, because I didn't kind of leave school and think I want to be an architect. I kind of wanted to go to art school, and everything I've done has kind of taken this funny path, really. And it's been because something. Been somewhere and I've thought, oh, that's kind of cool, or that's interesting, and it's taken me to the next thing. So, and with reference and building, you know, it's like that diving board I showed at the beginning. You know, I can remember sitting on it thinking, this is really interesting, and then you look at it and you understand it, and you realise in its context why it's been made, and it's got a function, and it's that sort of reference that I find maybe plays back into thinking about what we do. Sorry, I really can't think
that's
of
fine.
who's
Thank
my
you.
favourite architect. I'll try. I'll think about it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so we wrap it up
Yeah.
here. Thank you very much, Roz.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.